Thank you for joining us today for our next edition of the 49er Industry Chat. My name is Noemi Guevara and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement. I am going to pause as we welcome our participants in today to make sure everyone's in. Thank you for joining us for this industry chat today. Before we start, I would like to let you know the session is being recorded and you must have accepted something. So thank you for that. We also want to encourage you to use our Q&A box located above or below your screen to submit any questions for our guest speaker today. And now it's my honor to introduce you. Darin Hayton is a proud CSULB alum, earned his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and a Master's of Arts in History. For the past 15 years, Darin Hayton has been the historian of science at Haverford College. He studied history and philosophy of science at the University of Notre Dame, and he has held fellowships in Vienna, Munich, London, and Wolfenbüttel. Darin was also a research officer at the History of Science Museum, Oxford, where he worked extensively with their collection of astrolabes. His research focused on the various rhetorical and material ways scientific knowledge is recognized, articulated, and rendered authoritative. In particularly, he studied the interplay between astrological practices and political authority in pre-modern Europe. His first book explored the place of astrology at the Holy Roman Court under Emperor Maximilian I. He is currently working on a series of case studies on the sciences of the stars that will illuminate the nature and practice of astrology in the later Byzantine Empire. Please join me in welcoming today's industry chat host, Darin Hayton. Thank you so much, Darin, for joining us today.
Noemi, thanks so much for having me. This is going to be great. I really look forward to chatting with you and the alumni and students who might write in.
Wonderful. We look forward to getting to know you a little bit better. So I think I usually like to start off, with your time through CSULB. Why did you, choose Long Beach, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, so I think that, like so many things in my life, the choice of Long Beach was a bit of a, I don't want to say it was happenstance, maybe that's the way I want to put it. It wasn't particularly intentional. I remember vividly, my mother was encouraging me to go to college, and I grew up in the Pasadena area by and large. And she said, let's go look at Cal State Long Beach. And we drove down there. And I remember, for reasons I can't explain, I remember pulling onto campus off of 7th Street and thinking, wow, I was just a high school student and thinking, wow, this is a college, this is a university. And for reasons I can't explain, it resonated with me. We spent a couple of hours wandering around. I largely got lost. It wasn't an organized tour or anything. And when that would have been early in the fall of my senior year at high school, and when it came time to apply, I applied. It was the only place I applied. I was fortunate; they admitted me, and I enrolled.
And you chose chemistry. Why did you choose chemistry as your undergraduate degree?
Because I'm a nerd. No. So in high school, I was the school I went to had a handful of AP classes, and I took AP chemistry and AP history because I was really interested in both of those. And when I came to Cal State Long Beach, I kind of thought I'd be a chemical engineer. And I took a semester of the introductory chemistry classes, and I just really enjoyed not just the chemistry, but the chemistry faculty in the chemistry department. They were supportive and welcoming and generous with their time and their knowledge. And I thought, well, why would I give up this chemistry faculty in order to go spend. I'm sure the engineering faculty are lovely, but I knew that the chemistry faculty were just amazing mentors. And I like chemistry, so why not just stay here? The other side of that issue was when I had enrolled, I was uncertain if I'd be a sort of study of the sciences or study history. And I chose chemistry instead of history, largely because chemistry took less time. There was no, I remember in the history classes, there was no shortcut to reading all of the material. And I'm not a tremendously fast reader. And it's not like you can read the first 20 pages of a book or a document or a source and know what's said on page 55. Whereas in chemistry, once you understood the set of the problem set that you were working on, you didn't have to do every single problem. So chemistry was a more efficient way to get through Long Beach than history was. So I opted for chemistry. And that efficiency was important to me because at the time I just started racing bicycles. And so I was balancing my life at Cal State Long Beach with a life that I was spending a lot of time on bicycles. So efficiency in my education was important to me at the time. That's my really short way of saying, or polite way of saying, I was trying to get an education while also giving me enough free time to ride my bike a lot.
Right. I've often heard, that the chemistry department, they're very hands-on with their students, and they just build this nice little family that many of the students will always remember from that department.
Yeah, I haven't been back and seen the chemistry department in 15 years or so, 20 years. But when I showed up, it was Peterson Hall 3. It was most of us were on most of the chemistry labs they'd spread out on Peterson Hall 2, but they were on the 3rd floor. There was a lounge where all the students hung out. There was a nice mix of established faculty and younger faculty. The faculty and students interacted really well together. There were lots of options for working in labs, even as in the summer between my freshman and my sophomore year, throughout my sophomore year. So it really just was an excellent experience for somebody who likes chemistry. If you don't like chemistry, it was a disastrous experience. But
so what was your transition like? You graduated, what were your plans once you graduated? But then after you graduated 10 years later, you came back and earned that history degree, that master's.
Yeah, so when I left, I graduated from Long Beach, and the shortest answer is I then fled the country, and I lived overseas for a number of years, and the excuse was I was going to continue studying chemistry. The real reason was I wanted to move to Europe to race my bicycle. And so I spent a bunch of time racing bicycles. My first real job in that sense was trying to support myself and feed myself on the money that somebody racing bicycles could make. And it's not a particularly big salary. And I meandered around for a long time and continued. I had some goals and aspirations. And when those didn't come to, I happened to find myself teaching high school in Long Beach at a high school just downtown. And I thought, well, if I'm not going to pursue chemistry, maybe it's time to go back to history.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the change. And I thought I was interested in getting a PhD because I thought I wanted to be a professor. And I knew that I wouldn't be, with just a bachelor's degree in chemistry, I didn't have the credentials or the training or the experience or the expertise to get into a PhD in history. And so I was in Long Beach, so I enrolled in the master's program in history at Cal State Long Beach. I had already become familiar with a number of the faculty there. Because when I was undergraduate, I took a bunch of history courses. So it was a natural fit to come back, as it were. And while I was there, I befriended more of the faculty and was made aware that there's this thing called history of science. And it seemed like a natural pairing given my chemistry background and my interest in history. So I wrote a master's thesis on sort of a 17th century English intellectual who was interested in philosophy. And then acquired, while I was the 3 years that I was there, acquired the skills that I thought necessary to do a good job at history. So I took a lot, I can't speak highly enough of the language courses and the other options that are available at Cal State Long Beach. I took French and German and Latin and Greek throughout the time that I was here. I even took a couple of Italian courses. So it was a great experience to sort of establish a foundation for working in history.
Wonderful. Can you share with us a little bit what that history of science really is? Is it like an interdiscipline, or is it some, just mashing it together? The two things like?
So it really depends on the scholar. And in many ways, the way that I approach history of science, it is just another type of history. So we have some historians who work on politics. We have some historians who work on warfare. We have some historians who work on religion, but we don't tend to call them historians of religion or historians of politics or historians of warfare. They might in their small specific gatherings, but as a rule, we just call them historians. And the way that I do history of science is very much the same. I happen to be interested in the history of humans trying to understand the natural world. What tools do they develop? What logic do they deploy? What do they consider evidence? What's the use of that knowledge? Again, very broadly, we might call it science. Pre-1800, it doesn't look much like the science we have today. But there's a set of, shall we say, mental exercises and practices and frameworks that I think the people I'm interested in 13th, 14th century Constantinople, now Istanbul, and Isaac Newton in 17th century England, and Charles Darwin in 19th century England, and Einstein in 20th century Princeton, that they share. And so the history of science for me really is about trying to understand how and why first, and then how people have turned to the natural world. They've tried to understand that natural world. They've tried to make sense of it. And then to what ends do they put that information? So why do they bother developing scientific theories? Now it is the way that the PhD program I ended up in, it is a very interdisciplinary program in that it was a history and philosophy of science program. And we ended up taking quite a few philosophy courses as well as history courses. Some of my colleagues wrote dissertations that were remarkably technical, scientifically technical or mathematically technical or logically rigorous, in a way that mine would read more like a history book as opposed to a science book. Some of my classmates wrote dissertations that would look a little more like a science book than a history book. So
I see. So I know you mentioned, you were preparing yourself for that PhD program. What do you recommend, students that think that they might want to, follow that academic life into higher ed do, maybe as an undergrad or definitely, in their master's program?
Yeah, so the challenge is always finding the discipline that you want to pursue for the rest of your life. Obviously, I didn't start off in one that I wanted to stay in. I think that if your aspirations are to go on to a PhD program, as an undergraduate, to begin developing the sort of relationships you have with your faculty, particularly those that are going to allow you to do work beyond research, inquiries beyond the classroom, whether it's when I was a chemistry major, most of my friends who weren't pre-med, who were interested in further studies in chemistry, we ended up working in labs of the chemistry faculty. When I came back and was doing my master's work in history, I worked for the faculty there beyond the classroom. So whether it was in helping them do particular research projects, or the 2 summers that I spent helping with the history teacher, a journal that used to be published out of may still be published out of the history department. These are these opportunities that will really serve students well when they try to move on into further education, whether it's just into a master's program or it's into a PhD program in any discipline. So as I said, I took a lot of language classes, and I have some really good friends still. Many of them are retiring, but in the language programs. And if you're working in languages, come up with, ask your faculty, what can you do beyond the classroom? How can you help with whether it's their research, or how can you devise research projects of your own that you can work with them in sort of realizing? I think those opportunities will really serve students well as they move on. And we'll also give them a sense, if they think they want to go into academia, give them a sense of the best part of academia, which is that sort of research and that intellectual inquiry that we often call the life of the mind, which I'm not really sure that's all it's cracked up to be, but that's another story.
Is there a professor that inspired or influenced your decision to go into academics?
I don't think there was one. There were a lot. Again, if I start with my sort of chemistry faculty, Dr. Mersic, who was the chair when I entered, and Dr. Dorothy Goldish, were, in many ways, I saw them as the sort of senior members of, they may not have been, but I saw them as senior members of the chemistry department. And they were just, again, they were so generous and smart and helpful. And then I got to know Peter Bain, who was a physical chemist, who was also incredibly generous with his time and knowledge. I worked with, because I was interested in organometallic chemistry, I worked with a young faculty member who has since left Long Beach, Steve McDowell, who was also generous with his time and energy and knowledge. And it was a sort of a combination of their experiences and their encouragement and their confidence and their support that I think that helped convince me that I could be an academic, and that there was a really interesting life to be made that way. Then beyond chemistry, I think in the history department, similarly, there were a bunch of faculty who were supportive and encouraging. Again, most of them, they've either unfortunately passed away or have retired now. But they saw that they had the sort of confidence and generosity to encourage me forward, even at times when I probably didn't deserve it. When I think about those early fumbling times and how much faculty when I was an undergraduate or when I was a master's student, how much faculty really bolstered my confidence in moving forward. And they were all in that way sort of models for a type of life that I imagined would be really rewarding and fulfilling.
Definitely. And then, so in your bio, I also saw you were a research officer for the History of Science Museum in Oxford. Can you share about your experience there?
Yeah, it's Oxford, England. What's not to love? It's an amazing, amazing town with a rich and storied history, and often thought of as certainly one of the pinnacles of sort of academic scholarly production.
Right.
I got the research position after I finished my PhD, and it was a position that was targeted to, they were looking for historians of science, and the Museum of the History of Science there, the History of Science Museum, that's what it's called now. The History of Science Museum has the world's largest collection of astrolabes. And astrolabes are these medieval astronomical instruments. They are the most common, they were the most commonly used scientific instrument prior to the invention of the telescope. So they were incredibly important, and they're beautiful. They can be beautiful, they can be pragmatic. Anyway, the History of Science Museum has the world's largest single collection of them. And they appointed me the research officer to work through, catalog, describe, transcribe, translate their collection of astrolabes, and to make it available. This was 2004, 2005, to make that collection available in a really robust way to anybody who had access to the internet. So part of the project was to produce an online, and it's, although it looks a little dated now, it's still available, an online, completely searchable database of their entire collection with descriptions and translations and transcriptions, and it's searchable by every possible sort of little iota and fragment we could imagine somebody might want to search it through. So I was there to work on the astrolabes and their collection, which spans from the late 9th century up to the 20th century chronologically, and spans geographically the sort of South Asia, India, subcontinent region, all the way to the States, North America. It's just an awe-inspiring collection, but it's Oxford, and it's next to the Bodleian, which is one of the most famous libraries ever. And I had quite a lot of time to do a bunch of my own research and just kind of enjoy Oxford. It was an amazing place to spend a year and some change.
Wonderful. So from there, then, is that where you transitioned and came back to the East Coast, to the States, to start teaching?
I did. So I knew that the position in Oxford was a limited term position. And so I would have to, if I wanted to continue as an academic, I was going to have to look for a job. And so the first fall that I was there, the way that the job market works in academia, jobs tend to get posted in the fall. You apply for them in the winter. If you're lucky enough to get a job, you are told that you got a job sometime in the spring, and then you start the following year. So almost immediately on arriving in Oxford, I was paying attention to job ads that were coming up for historians of science. And I applied as one does in academia. You apply for every job that you think you have any chance at, because you never know what's going to happen. And I was incredibly fortunate. My colleague, whom I'm working with this term again, was on the search committee. They thought my application was worth talking to me. I remember this late night call, Friday afternoon, Friday evening, Saturday evening. I was in Oxford, they're here, so there's 6 hours, 7 hours difference between us, talking to the members of the search committee. And then, I guess I didn't put them off at that point, so I was able to come to campus. Yeah, and I came to campus for an interview. It was the academic world. For those of you who aren't familiar, the academic interviews are very different from most industry interviews. They tend to span, when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, they tend to span 2-3 days. But because I was coming from overseas, they were really keen on saving some of the travel money. And so mine was actually 4 or 5 days long.
Oh, wow.
And I showed up, and my now department, they were incredibly generous with their time and didn't abandon me after a couple of days. So I came in and gave a job talk, met all of what became my colleagues, met colleagues outside of my department, and they offered me the job. And you know, it's a great institution. Philadelphia is a fine town. I'm not from this area, so I'm still, even after 15 years, I wouldn't say I feel at home in the Mid-Atlantic. And Haverford's a much different place in many ways, from Cal State Long Beach, where we have now, I think there are 1,400 students here total.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, a 20th of what's at Cal State Long Beach. It's a
we're
tiny
close to 40,000
right.
students.
It's a tiny fraction of what I had been used to. And the campus it's smaller than Cal State Long Beach. So there are marked differences that I don't want to say are bad, but still sometimes surprise me. But yeah, left Oxford and ended up here just outside of Philadelphia.
Wonderful. How does your own research influence how you teach the history of science? Do you think it's imperative to do research before you can teach?
Yes, I do think it's essential to do research on some level. And I think it's essential to do research the way that I am an academic. And I suspect that the way that I'm an academic is shaped by the ways that, again, my faculty mentors at Long Beach and the Notre Dame were academics. But I think that what keeps my mind sharp and my inquiry interesting and the questions I'm asking worth asking is an active research, shall we say, program. I think it's that research, in my mind, if I were to put it really bluntly, really simply, research is evidence that there's a curiosity that's driving you. And I think that's really important. That curiosity is really important if you're going to be a professor or a teacher of some sort. And I think it's important both because it helps, and I'll keep it focused on me, it helps me continue to think about what it is I'm doing and why I'm doing it. It also helps because it's just surprising and it's wonderful and it's amazing when you stumble across something that you didn't expect, and you get to sort of pause for a few minutes and think about it. And maybe that pausing for a few minutes turns into a much bigger project, one that takes 6 months to realize or 2 years to realize or something. Maybe it's just a note you put in your head that you might come back to at some point. But I think that the research is, as I say, it's the outward manifestation of a profound curiosity. I also think it's important because I think it's really useful for faculty to recall what it's like not to know something and to try to learn that. It's incredibly easy for us to fall into patterns where we just keep talking about what we know and we forget what it's like to learn. And for me, at least, the reason I became one of the main reasons I became a professor is because I actually think it's really powerful to remember how to learn, to be surprised. And if we're doing research, we're still learning I think in a profound way. And that reminds us that our students are learning, and our students don't know what we know, and they're having to go through the process of trying to figure that out. And what does it mean to figure that out? How do you go about figuring that out? I think it's the process of doing research, being engaged in research at whether it's a really grand level, you're writing lots and lots of books, or it's a much narrower level, you're writing smaller articles, or perhaps even a narrower level where you're contributing to articles. I think that process of doing research reminds us, helps us remember that that students too, in some ways, are doing research and what it means to learn and how to go about learning.
Yeah, just keeping curious is always exciting, and staying active and alive. Is that why your fellowships, you had various fellowships, were those paid or were they unpaid? And like you just said, it was, you know, things that interest you and make you a better person or well-rounded professor now.
So all the fellowships I've had have been, they've come with a stipend of some sort. It's even being a historian, historians are relatively inexpensive when it comes to research, but even being a historian, it can be a costly, an expensive endeavor, whether it's traveling to archives across the country or in foreign, in other countries, across oceans, spending time at those places. These all, it does cost money and time. So my fellowships tend to be, they come with a stipend that offsets, usually doesn't cover all of the costs, but certainly offsets. And so in some of these instances, such as when I was in Munich or when I was in the first time I was in Vienna, those projects were funded by organizations. I had applied for fellowships and support for my dissertation research. And I made the case persuasively that I needed to spend 6 months or a year in these places where I could get easy access and repeated access to archival collections of medieval manuscripts, early modern printed books. Some of the other fellowships have been more targeted, but they tend to, so a particular project, perhaps after I finish the dissertation, or a particular part of the book project. But again, the mechanism tends to be, I look for a fellowship that will monetarily support my work near where I need to do that work. So some fellowships are, they support work anywhere. The National Endowment for the Humanities, for instance, or National Science Foundation, these will support work, will support you going anywhere. Other fellowships are linked to particular collections. And in those instances, you have to spend time thinking about whether or not that collection, that library, that archive has the material you need. So when I was in Northern Germany at Wolfenbüttel, that library just happens to have a lot of stuff that was relevant to my work. And so I made the case that I would make good use of the resources there. So.
Wonderful. What does balance look like between teaching, mentoring your students, and doing your own research and writing? Is that hard to, balance in your everyday life?
Yes, it is the really short answer. It's all but impossible. It takes a lot of discipline, particularly during term time when teaching, and I think more importantly, what I will call the bureaucratic work of being a faculty member sort of invade and creep in, and those take up both time and I think more importantly, or equally importantly, psychic energy. When you're done preparing for a class, teaching a class, working with students for some time, grading some papers, even if it's only 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there's just a level of exhaustion that sets in at that point. So it does take a lot of discipline. What I've found worked well for me, because I'm an early riser, is I get up early and I carve out the first part of the day for my own research and my own writing. I don't always get a lot of time. Maybe it's only an hour and a half, maybe it's an hour, but it comes before all of the other sort of obligations and tasks of the day. And that lets me focus on my research and my writing or my reading, whatever it looks like. And then once and then there's a sense of accomplishment in that domain of being an academic. And then I can turn without a sense of guilt to teaching and mentoring students and working with colleagues and on committees and all of the other aspects of being a faculty member these days. I usually do that balance. I can usually maintain until about the middle of the semester, and then increasingly I lose the morning hour because the semester just picks up speed and there's more to do, and there I spend more time with students, I spend more time grading, there are more committee meetings that need attention, and so it's the second half, or usually about the second half of the semester, that I really have to work to continue to carve out time. And then what tends to happen is I carve out time on days I'm not actually in the classroom or meeting with students, because I can, on those days, it's easier for me to make peace with myself that I'm just going to close my door and do my own work, my own research for the next hour or so.
Wonderful. Is publishing required at Haverford College, and how and when did you know you were ready to author a book, and what was the process like?
So yeah, as a rule here, we have to produce scholarship of some sort, and that tends to be in the form of published material, whether it's articles or it's books. And it varies from discipline to discipline. Some disciplines rely more heavily on articles. History tends to rely more heavily on books. So yeah, we expect that our faculty will carve out time somewhere to do some research and publish the results of that research. As for when I knew that I was ready, I don't think I ever did, and I don't tend to go back and look at the book that I published, because as I move on, I think if I went back and looked at it, I don't want to say be disappointed, but I would think, oh, I would do it so differently now. So I don't know if I ever thought I was ready, in so much as I thought this just needs to get done. And it needed to get done not just because I wanted to get tenure and continue being employed, gainfully employed, but it needed to be done because any book, any project, any research project like this, if you don't stop working on it, it will never stop. And there's no value in working on a project for 30 years. I mean, no broad value. There may be some personal value, but at that point, it just becomes a hobby. And hobbies are wonderful, but that's not what I get paid to do. I get paid to do something else. So in that sense, I think on the one hand, I never knew that I was ready to write a book. On the other hand, I knew that I was ready to write a book, because writing a book or writing an article finishes a project, and there's something so satisfying about finishing it, however good or bad it is. It's done. It takes a real, and now I don't mean to make this sound like I'm particularly special. I don't think I am, but it takes a certain type of courage to finish a project and just be done with it. It's much easier to continue to fiddle. And I think my book is my book. It's, there's some really good parts and some really not so good parts. I don't think there are any bad parts. But it's done, and that's really what needs to happen. So I knew at some point that I was ready to be done with this project, so I could move on to another one.
Wonderful.
So, was there a third part to that question that I've now forgotten?
Yeah. What was the process? What did the process look like?
It looked like a lot of spent printer paper. So the process looked at, if you see behind me, that's what it kind of looked like. It was a lot of time in this room and a lot of time revising material, writing something that I thought was a chapter, and maybe it's 25, 30 pages long, and then realizing when I've moved through what I think are two other chapters, that first thing that I thought was a chapter is nowhere near a chapter, and disassembling it and putting it back together in other ways, or distributing that material, dividing that chapter into, say, 3 little parts. Each part belonged perhaps in another chapter. So it's a process of it's a series of cycles. You think this chapter is done, so you move on to the next, and when you finish that one, you realize that the previous one's not done for some reason, and you keep sort of cycling around until the differences that you are introducing look a little less each time. And so, if I were to put this really bluntly, what does it look like? It looks like a lot of writing and rewriting and staring at a screen and then sending parts to friends that you trust to read your material and getting their feedback. And then once you have something that's close to what you think is a book, then you step aside and you write a book proposal, which is, mine was, I don't know, 10 pages long. And the book proposal is sort of a marketing ploy for your book. So it's this entirely other document that nobody ever teaches you how to write, which is maybe short-sighted. Nobody ever teaches you how to write a book proposal, but you've got to write a book proposal, and then you, once you have the book proposal done, then you send a bunch of emails to editors at presses that might publish your book, giving them a sort of one paragraph summary of what the book is about, hoping that the one paragraph summary encourages them enough to ask for the proposal, which you've written, because then you can send the proposal to them. And then if the proposal looks interesting, they might ask for the book. So it's a very convoluted
never-ending
process.
cycle.
Yeah. But it happens and it gets done.
Wonderful. It sounds like you found your purpose with research and teaching. Any advice for our students or alumni who are interested in academia but aren't sure where to start with a research project?
Yeah, this is going to sound glib and perhaps unsophisticated, but just when you find something that surprises you, that's your research project. Whatever, and how do you find something that surprises you? Well, here there's no substitute for, if you're in the historical, sort of the book and text centered disciplines or heavy disciplines, do a lot of reading, and you will find you will find ideas that you find interesting start to leap off the pages. I was reading an article a number of years back, and the article was about medieval astrology, but it made reference to the practices of late 19th, early 20th century patent medicine companies in this country, in the States. Patent medicine companies were these companies that sold effectively liquor and claiming it was medicine. Anyway, that tidbit in this article was fascinating to me because of what it said about astrology in the 19th century in the sort of US context. So that got noted down. It has since become an article-sized project. So spend a lot of time to get started with research, spend a lot of time reading or looking at the material that you're interested in. If you're interested in visual, the disciplines that are reliant on visual sources more, look at visual sources. If you're in the sciences, work through the material that is relevant to your discipline, and start keeping just little notes, 3x5 cards of things that surprise you. And it's those surprises that will become the starting point for a research project. You start pursuing them, and that little tiny kernel blossoms out, and suddenly it becomes an entire sort of garden. If we stick with the blossom metaphor for a second, it becomes an entire garden, and before long it's an entire farm. I mean, you start pursuing any one of these topics, and you're going to find that it just opens up before you in amazing ways.
Great advice. How has travel and worldly experiences influenced your love for what you do and your ongoing curiosity?
So right. Travel and living outside of living in various countries. In some sense, it is responsible for why I'm a historian of science and not a chemist. When I left the country, when I came back, I actually had been admitted to the UC Santa Barbara PhD program in chemistry. But I was, the chemists who were there, who are all very, very smart people, both the faculty and the students, they brought something different to the table. And I was looking for, I was looking at, glibly put, perhaps, I was looking for a more worldliness. I was looking for a broader set of horizons than the chemists there were bringing to the table, for the most part. Again, really smart chemists, very good at what they did. But no longer was, I didn't see chemistry as fulfilling the sort of questions and needs I had. And history, pardon me, I think why I'm so drawn to history is because history in so many ways, lots of people have said something to this effect, history is another world, it's another country. You can't, I can't do history without being constantly amazed and vaguely uncomfortable. And it in every instance, it reminds me that the way that I see the world isn't the only reasonable or logical or coherent way to see the world. And if I'm going to do justice to both the way that I see it and the way that people in the past saw it, it's got to be through this mechanism, this process of curiosity and empathy and compassion. And so I would say that whatever it is that makes me curious about living in other places and trying to get by in other cultures, whether that is geographically distant or temporally distant, I think those are all of the same. I couldn't be curious about history without being curious about other cultures, other peoples, other places. That doesn't mean that they both don't at various times frustrate me. And I think, come on, we know how to do this. And this isn't how, but I think that the two go hand, certainly in my mind, they go hand in hand.
Wonderful. Well, I know we're up against time, so I have, I guess, one more question. Any final thoughts, observations you would like to share with our fellow students and alumni who are watching or will be watching?
Yeah, so I think for students, I'll start with the students. I would just encourage you to take advantage of everything Long Beach has to offer, particularly around cultivating and fostering your intellectual curiosity, whether it's in the engineering program or the College of Business Administration, or it's in the history and the languages or the sciences, it doesn't matter. I think there are opportunities. If you just start to scratch the surface at Long Beach, you're going to find amazing opportunities that will help you grow in all sorts of ways, whether it's to end up sitting in front of a bookshelf full of books, or it's to end up in an office of some other sort. As for alumni, I would imagine most of them have excellent lives, and they don't need advice from me. If I were to tell them, if I were to suggest anything, I would say, build on all the great experiences you had at Long Beach, particularly about what I was just saying for students, cultivating curiosity and interest beyond whatever it is you do. Again, I'm probably preaching to the choir because my guess is many of them already do this. So.
Wonderful. Thank you, Darin, so much for your time. We've learned a lot. Before we go, if any of our students would like to get in contact with you, is there a best way? Not sure if you're on LinkedIn or if you want them to email us, and we'll put them in contact with you via email.
They can reach out. I don't have a LinkedIn profile, but they can reach out to me directly here at Haverford. So they can either send me an email, which is my first initial D, my last name Hayton, Hayton at haverford.edu. I try to maintain what I consider a professional web page. So if you just do a search, a Google search for Darin Hayton at Haverford, you will come up with it. And there's an Ask Me Anything link on there, which I do my best to respond to. So they can do that. Yeah.
Wonderful. And then before we go, are we going to see you on a Tour de France someday?
No, I was, while that was a goal, it was one of those aspirations that sadly didn't go fulfilled. Alas. So no.
Say never.
Yeah, when they have the old guys Tour de France, maybe I'll try out for that one.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We can't wait to welcome you back to campus when you're visiting in the area.
I look forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please visit our website or follow us on social media to learn about our future chats. And we thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.